right, so we're moving on from our invertebrates, and now we're going to start talking about the vertebrates, which are animals that have a backbone. So, keep in mind that vertebrates are over 1 billion years old. The first ones were really small. They lived in water. And then what we're going to see as we go through the different groups is that the vertebrates were able to, through natural selection and mutations and all kinds of divergent evolution, they were able to gain structures that allow them to move to land. And we're going to go through all the different classes of vertebrates and talk about some of the things that they have. So the evolution, for example, of limbs, like legs, would have allowed them to then move on land. And there are over 57,000 vertebrate species. So let's jump right in to the vertebrates. So first of all, the phylum is actually not called vertebrate. So remember all the phyla we went through, like arthropod and echinoderm and annelid, platyhelminths, all of that. Well, the phylum that vertebrate animals belong to, like us, is called Chordates or Chordata. So Chordata has to do with having 4 specific characteristics. So vertebrate is actually not a phylum, it's a subphylum, and we're going to talk about that momentarily. So the 4 characteristics that everything in the phylum Chordata has are, number 1, a dorsal nerve cord. In other words, if you recall, the crayfish and the earthworm both had a ventral nerve cord. It ran down their belly. So all Chordata, or invertebrates as well, all have a dorsal nerve cord. It runs down our back, our spinal cord. Secondly, there's a flexible rod called the notochord. Now, in us, the notochord does not exist as adults. We have a backbone. It basically becomes our backbone. But in some of the more primitive chordates, it stays a notochord. So it's just a flexible rod that basically is going to protect. It's going to be right with the nerve cord. And again, in us, it sort of turns into our spinal column. Third, these things called pharyngeal slits, or sometimes they're called pharyngeal pouches or gill slits. And in this picture, you can see them on the right. These are the pharyngeal pouches or the gill slits here. And they are, in some chordates, they actually become gills. In us, they actually become, they sort of fold in and become things like some of our tonsils, some of our glands, our eustachian tube that runs from our mouth to our ears. But as an embryo, we do have these pharyngeal slits and a post-anal tail. So if you look, so you will see here that there's an anus. We have a one-way digestive tract. All chordates have this one-way digestive tract. And the other thing is this post-anal tail, a tail that extends beyond that anus. Now you might say, hey, wait, we don't have a tail, but we do as an embryo, and then that tail sort of disintegrates and we're left with just our tailbone. So these 4 characteristics, everything in the phylum Chordata has these at some point in their life. All right, and this is a simple chordate here in this picture. Now, the simplest chordates do not actually form a backbone. They keep that notochord, and these are your tunicates and your lanceolets. And the pharyngeal slits, if we go back a slide here, they actually become part of a filter feeding system. Tunicates, I believe there's going to be a picture on the next slide. They are stationary, sessile, they don't move, but the larvae look kind of like tadpoles. And then lanceolets, both of them, they're marine. They both use, like I said, they filter feed. Again, the 4 features that we share, even though we don't have them as adults, that's going to be those pharyngeal slits, post-anal tail, the notochord, the flexible rod, and then the dorsal nerve cord. So here is a lanceolet on the left. And on the right, a tunicate, which looks like, it really does not look like it would be advanced enough to be a vertebrate, but look at the embryo. The embryo has those 4 characteristics. So that's tunicates and lanceolets. Very, very simple, tiny organisms. Okay, so moving on. The characters that basically show us our vertebrates, the diversity of the vertebrates, come from all this evidence that we've collected. Now remember, classification. We classify organisms today based on these same kinds of evidence, like vestigial structures and homologous structures, molecular data like DNA sequences, fossils that tell us when the organisms lived, and that's how we've sort of come up with these different clades or groups of chordates and each of the classes that we're going to talk about. So here's the overview. So here's your tunicates and lancelets. They are chordates, just like us, but right here, this is where the vertebral column developed. And so notice everything past this point, these are all going to be in the subphylum Vertebrata or vertebrates. So when you hear the term vertebrate, it's actually not a phylum, like I said. Chordata is the phylum we belong to, and these two organisms, the lancelets and the tunicates, are also in Chordata, but notice, starting here, everything from here down, this is our vertebrates. And what you're going to see as we go through these groups is the development of different things that allowed us to become more complex and particularly to move to land. So, for example, the lampreys and the hagfish don't have jaws. Then when jaws developed, you're going to see these different groups of fish which have jaws. However, sharks only have a cartilage skeleton. Ray-finned fish actually have a bony skeleton with calcium. Then we're going to see the development of lungs. So some of these lobe-finned fish actually have the beginnings of legs. They actually have bones in their fins, as opposed to these that have the, just the little bones that look like this. These guys actually have bones that are primitive bones like what we would have in our arms and legs, like thicker bones. Then we're going to see those lobed fins become legs. We're going to see the development of lungs. Actually, that's already here, sorry. And then amniotic egg we're going to talk about, which is a way of reproducing on land and not having to go back to water. Amniotic egg, like if you think of a chicken egg or a snake egg, these don't dry out on land. And then mammals, notice, give milk to their young. Now, they left birds off of this, so there's some talk about birds being classified with the reptiles. The older books are going to show birds also as a separate group. But there's some talk about like merging the birds and reptiles because they're almost like, they have very similar characteristics, but there's some very big differences too. So we're going to talk about that. So next time, we're going to start by talking about our simplest groups, our fish. And we're going to talk about the lamprey, the hagfish, the chordate, which is like sharks and stingrays. And then we're going to talk about the bony fish.